Hello and welcome to today's presentation on the evolution of cyber risk quantification. My name is Jen and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's presenter is Jack Jones, Chief Risk Scientist at Rheinland, Chairman of the FAIR Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to evolving risk management practices. Jack has worked in technology, information security, and risk management for over 30 years, and is the creator of the Factor Analysis of Information Risk, FAIR framework, adopted by the Open Group as an international standard. We also welcome Mike Makowka, Chief Information Security Officer at TUV Rheinland OpenSky. Mike will be guiding this discussion from a CISO's point of view. Previously, Mike was a CISO for Leo Cybersecurity, where he designed and executed security programs. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Jack. Jack, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So the title of this, the evolution of cyber risk quantification. In a sense, we can also think of this as the evolution of our industry's ability to make well-informed decisions, because really that's what this is about. It's not about quantifying stuff. That's not the goal. The goal is to help our stakeholders and ourselves understand our problem space more accurately and at a deeper level, so that we can make better use of the resources we have and such. So that's really what this is about. The goal isn't quantification. The goal is better decision making, better risk management. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there up front. And the conversation about cyber risk quantification has really taken a fairly straightforward path in a sense. In the early days, there was a pretty strong belief, and frankly, there's still many people in the industry who subscribe to this. They ask, can it be quantified? Or some people just flat out say, no, it can't be quantified. And we can have conversations about that. I've had those conversations for almost 20 years now, and it's clear that it can be quantified. So, if anyone's sort of still clinging to that belief, it's probably time for them to look around and see the facts on that. But so this question really has been answered pretty much without any question or doubt. The conversation then evolved to, okay, so we can quantify it. Should we? I mean, what's the advantage to that? And there are still a lot of people, with this question in mind. And actually, a lot of what we'll cover today is intended to illustrate the advantages to quantification and the limitations and challenges associated with how our industry has been approaching risk measurement. And then once someone buys into the fact that, okay, there are real advantages to this, then the question becomes, all right, how do we do it? And that's where FAIR comes in. FAIR is sort of that foundational element that enables pragmatic, real-world quantification of our problems. And then the next level of the conversation, we've begun to see more and more about this, where organizations said, okay, we get how to do it and that we should do it, but how do we bake it in? How do we build a program around that? And that's sort of the next level of conversation around that. And we'll touch on this a little bit in this session, but we won't go deep here because it's deserving of a session all unto itself, which hopefully we can cover in another webinar. So getting to that why it matters question, should we do it in the first place? And the question I like to ask CISOs or anybody else for that matter is, what's the cost of let's say a $5 million risk management program? And that seems like a rhetorical question, but it's really not, because if you stop and think about it, every dollar being spent on risk management or cybersecurity is a dollar that's not being spent growing the business. So there's an opportunity cost there. Furthermore, a lot of the operational costs associated with executing on a risk management strategy, things like patching and access privilege management and these sorts of things are performed by people outside of the cybersecurity organization. So the cost of that activity and those resources isn't showing up on the, on the ledger for cybersecurity. It's being captured elsewhere, and sort of a general overhead, if you will. So very clearly, the cost of a risk management program extends well beyond sort of that, what's on the ledger for it, right? What's within the budget for cybersecurity. And if we think in those terms, it becomes even more important for us to make sure that those resources are being spent cost effectively, right? Where they have the greatest bang for the buck. And so there's another way to look at it here. So if we say across the bottom is how much money we're putting into cyber risk management or cybersecurity, and along the vertical axis is sort of how much cyber-related risk an organization has. And clearly there are diminishing returns, and it's not a linear scale, but really the point I want to drive home here is, what if you're not very good at applying those resources, right? So you're spending, let's say, that amount of money, but you're getting that kind of return in terms of risk reduction when you could be getting that. And that should beg the question, what's driving the difference? Why one versus the other? And really, that's what a lot of we'll be talking about today, and that is the value proposition, if you will, to better risk measurement and in particular quantification. And really, what it boils down to is decision making, right? So, how well informed are our choices? Are we spending the resources we have, the limited resources? Invariably, they're limited resources. So how are we spending those resources? Are we really getting the kind of return on that we should from a risk reduction perspective? And let's look at an example. So let's say we're in an organization that uses a vulnerability scanning tool whose analytic engine is based on CVSS, which most today in the industry are. And CVSS scans and identifies a web application with a SQL injection weakness, and it says, oh my God, that's critical. And so the organization says, well, it says it's critical, so we must treat it as if it is critical. And so we take resources that might be working on business initiatives or potentially other security related things, and we apply it to this. And the question then is, was that a good decision, right? Well, maybe this application isn't internet facing and requires authentication before you can even find and exploit the SQL injection flaw. And maybe it doesn't have access to sensitive information. And if that's the situation, and all of those things are factors that CVSS and vulnerability scanners just miss entirely, right? They don't have these data points in their analytic function. So it's, that quote unquote critical rating that the scanner provided, we have to recognize that is just one data point in a set of data points that drive really how much loss exposure, how much risk this particular weakness represents. And very clearly, this organization probably could apply those resources elsewhere and get better bang for the buck in terms of their risk mitigation efforts, right? Rather than charging off and treating this as if it was truly critical when it's clearly not. So an organization who's operating in this mode, right, driving their vulnerability remediation efforts purely based on CVSS scores and such, the odds of them being cost effective in those efforts it doesn't exist. I mean, it's as close to zero as possible. So, again, this kind of thing is an example of where we as an industry have tremendous room for improvement from a cost efficacy perspective. Or maybe we have a couple of audit findings, right? One that says, well, this one application the access privileges aren't being updated reliably as people change roles or leave the organization, such, and clearly that's a control deficiency. And on the other one, it's, well, we have poor visibility into potentially illicit activity on our internal network, and there's clearly a weakness too. And maybe both of these have been characterized as quote unquote high, using a qualitative approach. And the question is, well, if they're both high, which one's higher, first of all? And furthermore, are they really both high? And if you actually did, and these are real world examples I'm drawing from, if you actually did real analysis on it, quantitative analysis, in this case, there's more than an order of magnitude difference between the two in the first place. One is clearly represents more loss exposure than the other. And furthermore, the access privilege problem here in this case is not high by at least any reasonable definition I've seen in organizations, right? Even though the maximum impact at $1.2 million, that's a tail event, and the probability of that, if you look at the loss exceedance curve, the probability of that size loss is almost vanishingly small. It exists, but if you're going to worry about things at that level, that vanishingly small probability of an event that size, then you might as well be worrying about asteroid strikes as well. So again, clearly the point here is that there's a tremendous amount of difference between these two, and generally speaking, you're only going to be able to recognize those differences through decent quantitative analysis. And until you're doing that, again, the opportunity to choose poorly here and focus on the wrong one is fairly significant.
Jack, I have a question. And this is fascinating. My question, though, is really around, what do you think's driving this? Is it more of a compliance by security or security by compliance kind of view from organizations, or how do you see that working? Because I've seen this in a lot of organizations. You get a CVS score, and they don't look at it holistically and what the actual impact is.
Right. I think part of the problem is we tend to place a lot of faith into the technologies that we buy and such, and in the models that have been adopted in the industry. And CVSS is the standard model that the industry has sort of hitched its wagon to, and therefore there's sort of this presumed accuracy and validity to the model. And unfortunately, it has quite a number of significant problems associated with it in terms of its ability to deliver accurate measurements of significance for vulnerability. So there's this sort of notion of, well, somebody somewhere said this is a good thing, so we're gonna assume they knew what they were doing, and we're going to buy into that too. I think that's one significant problem. Another is when it comes down to sort of the qualitative measures, like these two findings here on the screen right now, is qualitative has a couple of significant problems with it. We'll get into some of that a little bit more in a minute, but it is inherently profoundly imprecise. I mean, if you're using a high, medium, and low scale, or even let's say 5 levels, I mean, when you carve the entire continuum of sort of the probabilities and impacts associated with these kinds of events into 5 buckets or 3 buckets, I mean, that is profoundly imprecise. I mean, those are huge buckets. And furthermore, they're almost never well defined. So there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity, which again, we'll get into more on this in a little bit. But those are at least 2 of the sort of foundational challenges that have put us where we are as a profession from these kinds of analytic decision making.
So what would you say to people, because CVS looks like it's quantitative, right? It's on a scale of 1 to 10, but to me it seems very subjective. To your point, it doesn't take a holistic view. How would you say that if people say, well, that is CVS itself is a quantitative measure?
Well, it's really not though. So anytime someone wants to claim something as quantitative, there's one question you can ask to determine whether it's actually quantitative or not. And that is, ask them what the unit of measure is. Quantity of what? And CVSS is an ordinal scale, which is qualitative. Ordinal scales are qualitative by definition. And they've just, instead of using colors or words, they're using 1 through 10 numbers. Those are still labels. Those aren't quantities. And there is no unit of measure there. So it's qualitative, and I'll get more into that as we go along. But there is a tremendous amount of confusion. I'm glad you asked the question. There's a tremendous amount of confusion in this industry about what's quantitative and what's not. And again, a lot of people think that just because you're using numbers that it's quantitative. Well, that's absolutely not true. You have to be able to define what it is what you're quantifying. What's the unit of measure? Is it frequency? Is it magnitude of loss? Is it some percentage? Is it a count of chairs in the room? Whatever it is you're trying to measure, unless you can articulate clearly what the unit of measure is in real terms, is not quantitative. So there's a lot of confusion about that, and unfortunately, it leads us astray in a lot of ways. But
thank you for that excellent explanation. Please continue.
So let's say we choose correctly. We choose, the poor visibility into our internal network as the thing we're going to focus on. Then the question becomes, well, how do we address it, and really, what's the cost benefit there? And very often there's more than one option for remediation. But even if there's maybe not obviously more than one good option, still very often it can be helpful to, when you go asking for big bucks from your stakeholders, the people who hold the purse strings, it can be really useful to be able to articulate the cost benefit. And again, that's only going to be able to be done quantitatively. There's no way on God's green earth you can do a cost benefit analysis using ordinal qualitative things or CVSS or NIST-CSF or any of those things. You can't do cost benefit. So again, as stewards of our resources, we need to understand and very often be able to defend the recommendations we make and the expenditures we apply, so that we are making good use, or the best use of our resources. And that's, again, where quantification really helps. Again, something else we see over and over again out there is organizations put together lists of their top 10 risks. Many organizations are doing this. And those lists very often look a lot like this. And unfortunately, none of the things in this list are a risk. They're all part of the risk landscape. They all contribute to how much risk an organization has, but they aren't in and of themselves risks. And as a result, we can't measure them as risk. We can't compare them to one another. And bottom line is, honestly, we can't defend in real terms that they are our most significant concerns. We might believe they are, but there's no analytic basis for that belief. It's like, well, this scares me the most. And when this is exactly what I used to do before I started using FAIR, developing FAIR, and using FAIR. That's how I approach things. I get in a room with my senior security people on my staff. This was when I was CISO, and I'd say, what are our top quote unquote risks? And we would spitball stuff and argue endlessly and end up with some sort of list at the end of the day that we might believe in, but there was no analytic basis for it. Nothing that really stood up if you really poked and prodded at it, And here's the point. I mean, when you take the time to define your quote unquote top risks, well, what's expected to happen then? Well, you're expected to apply resources to those things to make the world safer, right? If those are your top risks, what do we do to make them not our top risks? And if the list you put together is not in fact your top risks, but because they were identified as such, you're committed to putting resources against them. Again, that gets back to that notion of, are we really applying our resources effectively or cost effectively? And honestly, no organization I've walked into, and colleagues of mine and I have gone into a number of organizations over the past 3 years that have, they put together their list of top risks and they wanted us to help them quantify them or validate them. And not once, and I mean not once in 3 years have we seen a list of top risks that has stood up. When you actually start analyzing around it, they never got it right, not even remotely right, which meant that if they'd gone forward and continued to treat their risk landscape as if those things were their top risks, they would not be cost effective in their application of resources, right? So, of course, the question that's begged from this is, well, if these aren't risks, what are risks? Well, risks are loss event scenarios. I mean, that at the end of the day, that's what we're supposed to be helping our organizations manage, is the frequency and magnitude of loss events. And these future loss events are scenarios, right? So an example is prolonged outage of business critical processes due to acts of nature or due to ransomware, or maybe a compromise of some large volume of sensitive information, or some regulatory consent decree because we aren't good at risk management or something like that, or maybe, a misstatement. But bottom line is these are loss event scenarios. Your top risks should be expressed as loss event scenarios. Those are only things that can be measured with likelihood and impact. You can't, a control deficiency or a threat vector like phishing or something like that, you can't put a likelihood and impact associated with that without a whole lot of assumptions being made and generalizations that can profoundly affect the accuracy. So the bottom line is risks are always loss event scenarios. Once you've identified what those are, what the loss event scenarios that your organization cares about, then you can begin to do the measurement that says, oh, okay, out of these 3 or 5 or however many are the ones where we have the greatest loss exposure. That's when you can really begin to focus on, all right, now what can we do to bring that loss exposure down for that scenario and that scenario and that scenario. And that's when you're going to begin to be able to be cost effective in your use of resources.
Jack, I'd like to dive, can we go back there? I'd like to dive into this a little bit more because I think this is happening across the industry. I know I've made this mistake. I would have said, and in my various positions, and I know a lot of other people that are new IT directors or even seasoned pros and CISOs. Yep. They make this mistake, and it's because, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it, there's this idea that security risk is somehow different than business risk, and what we're seeing here is that we're not properly probably illustrating it well. And I know this is a question for a lot of people when you go talk to your boards, when you go talk to your C-levels, speaking the business, and I know a lot of people have this trouble. So this is a great explanation. I'd really be interested to know a little bit more about how do we make these misconceptions? Is it just because we don't have enough data, or?
No, it really boils down to terminology. So the word risk is just tossed around out there in a very ambiguous sort of way and inconsistent way, right? So if we go back to the previous slide, this one, top risks, right? Again, 9 out of 10 or more security professionals in our industry will describe these things as risks. I mean, just over and over and over again. And the cloud is technology. Cloud isn't a risk. It's a kind of technology. And email, well, that's a technology or an application. Reputation is an asset. Phishing is an attack vector. Ransomware is a method used. Internet of Things, technology, insiders, those are assets, honestly, but they, can be bad for us, in certain circumstances. So it's maybe a threat community under certain circumstances. So these very different things, again, my point here is these are all very different parts of the risk landscape. And then when we munge them together into this sort of amorphous use of the word risk, we lose any opportunity to measure them effectively and therefore prioritize amongst them and really get a handle on them. It's only when we begin with this foundation of understanding that risks are loss event scenarios. And we can, you know, if that's our starting point, then a whole lot of things become clear, right? We begin to recognize the role that in that previous screen, all those, you know, things that aren't risks, we can begin to look at those and say, oh, that plays into this scenario, and this one plays into that scenario and that scenario. And now we have a context for understanding and evaluating the significance of those things we're concerned about, right? That list of stuff that's not risks. All right. We have a context then for really evaluating it, but the problem begins with this sort of misuse and misunderstanding of the word risk. And once we get past that, a whole lot of clarity begins to come into focus, and a lot of things that felt really hard, like measuring and think about your conversation with the board, right? You go to the board and you talk about phishing, or you talk about ransomware, you talk about insiders or whatnot, and they might have sort of this, based on media coverage or whatever, they might have this sense of dread of these things, but they aren't sure really what they mean to the business. But if you can put it in the context of, okay, this one, you know, prolonged outage of business critical processes due to ransomware, you know, and maybe you go to them and say, this is one of our top risks. We've done the analysis in this bubble to the top, and they get prolonged outage of business critical processes. Oh, okay, ransomware, and now they have a sense for sort of the likelihood and the impact of that, and you can talk to them about, here are the mitigation options that we've looked at and kind of cost benefit of that. You know, we can buy down this amount of risk at this cost. That's all stuff that they will, you know, immediately grasp. Whereas if all we talk about is ransomware and phishing and insiders and et cetera, you know, they're left to their own imagination about sort of how to make sense of that. And that's an unfortunate position to put them in, first of all. But it really begins with the verbiage, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that those are great points. You know, I know a lot of people that come up through the technology side. You know, the boards and the C-levels, they're used to business risks, but we've kind of, I don't want to say bastardized technology risk, or, you know, there is technology risk, but security, we've kind of gone off that path, and nobody's really been given, you know, a clear picture of how to talk to the business. So this is great content. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the bottom line here is our problem space is really complex and it's really dynamic. I mean, there's no argument about that anywhere. And we have limited resources, which means we have to be really good at prioritizing the things we focus on and the solutions we apply. I mean, we just have to, because if we're not good at this, the way I like to think of it is the bad guys come to the table with some inherent advantages that we have there's very little we can do about. They get to choose their targets, their timing, and their techniques, okay? But if we're rubbish at prioritizing and applying the resources we have, then we've just handed them another advantage. And we can't afford to do that. I mean, they have a head start anyway, so to speak. So this becomes, I think, especially important in our complex and dynamic world, that we really have to be good at filtering out the noise and recognizing the things that matter most. Unfortunately, you know, when I go into organizations, and my colleagues tell me the same thing, the vast majority of things that are labeled as high risk, if you do the analysis, aren't, which means there's this huge signal to noise problem where organizations aren't able to recognize, identify, and treat the things that matter most. You know, so more important things are left on the back burner as less important things are being dealt with as if they're critical. And we just simply can't afford to do that.
Jack, what would you attribute that to? Is that our misclassification and misdiagnosis of risks, or what we believe to be risk, or is it more of a because it's qualitatively and it's this is how I feel about it that I label these things?
It's all of the above. It is misclassification, the misuse of nomenclature and terms. It's misunderstanding of fundamental sort of analytic principles, and it's qualitative measurement. It's all of that, which means it's there is not a silver bullet to fixing this. We have to get clarity around our nomenclature. We have to set aside the fallacies and misperceptions around measurement. We have to evolve beyond qualitative measurement into quantitative. And if we want to not just be cost effective, but actually have a prayer of winning the battle against the bad guys, this is not optional. But it's a suite of things, and you have to know what the problems are before you can fix them, of course. So yeah.
Well, we've talked quite a bit about risk. Why don't we let's talk a little bit more about FAIR. Continue on.
Okay. Well, so I have some slides here in a bit. I mean, there are a couple more things I'd like to hit on. I'll go through these quickly because we've sort of talked around some of this already. So other common causes, absence of critical thinking. We tend to rely on best practice, and you surfaced that earlier in your question about sort of our reliance on CVSS and whatnot. It's a great example where we just say, well, it's CVSS, so we'll use that, rather than really thinking a little more deeply about it. Math on ordinal scales. I mean, nobody I know would feel comfortable with this math equation, yet you substitute 1, 2, and 3 in there, and people think math stands up. No, not even close. And broken models. And here's an example of a model, and I think this is another really good illustration. So this is only half the model. It's only looking at the likelihood of loss. It's not looking at the loss magnitude. That's another part of the model. And this is, I'll tell you which model this is from here in a minute. But along the vertical axis is the likelihood of an attack, and the bottom axis, it's likelihood of the attack being successful. And so the question is, again, this is just looking at the likelihood of loss, not the impact. What value should be in that box? And when I am giving a presentation in person to audiences, I'll ask them, and invariably the answer I get is high. In other words, they're taking that moderate likelihood of an attack and the very high likelihood of attack success, and they're kind of in their mind, they're averaging, right? And that is in fact what this model does. It says high, but here's the problem. If let's take that likelihood of an attack and change those from words to numbers. So instead of very high, we're going to call that 100%. And instead of very low, 1%. Instead of moderate, we're saying 50%, right? So just sort of logical and intuitive likelihoods in percentages. So we have a 50% likelihood in the coming year, let's say, of a certain type of attack. Well, maybe it's a distributed denial of service. So 50% likelihood of that attack taking place, and we're going to do the same thing across the bottom, substituting those percentages for those words. And very high, we're going to say 100%. So we have a 100% likelihood of, 100% likelihood of success for an attack that has a 50% likelihood of occurring. Well, I'm sorry, the highest value you can have in that row, that moderate row, is moderate. You can't have greater than 50% likelihood in any of those boxes in that row. So 100% likelihood of a 50% likely attack is still 50%. Can't be higher than 50%. So the highest value you could have in that box instead of high is moderate. So this model got that wrong. Oh, and by the way, I got it wrong here, and it got it wrong here. And in fact, every box in red, if you actually did sort of the numeric approach to this, got it wrong. So, roughly 2/3 of the answers in this matrix, in this model, are wrong. and that's NIST 800-30. Okay, which probably doesn't feel good to anybody, but it's the example of where qualitative measures allow you to make these kinds of mistakes. And the reason I recognized this mistake the minute I saw it in their model is because when I was first developing FAIR, before I was using FAIR quantitatively, I developed it qualitatively first. And the matrix I had then for this very same intersection of likelihood of an attack and likelihood of success, I made the exact same error they did. And I only learned that it was an error when I started doing quantitative analysis. I said, wait a minute, I can't have a higher probability of loss than I have of the attack taking place in the first place. That violates a fundamental law of probability. I mean, it can't exist in this universe. So, it's an easy mistake to make when you're doing things qualitatively, which is one of the reasons quantitative is improvement. Now, there are going to be those out there saying, well, yeah, but all models are broken, but some are useful. That's an old adage in the model world. And that's true, but this isn't simply a matter of, imprecision. This is a matter of fundamentally being broken, violating the law of probability. So there's a difference between, broken with a capital B and broken with a lowercase b. This is capital B, all right? So again, an example of where qualitative kind of leads us astray. Other questions, I won't spend much time on this because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. These kinds of questions around are the kinds of things that should be asked of qualitative measures, and frankly can't be answered in any sort of meaningful and stand-up way, if you will, right? So that should, one of my colleagues calls this slide the slide of shame, but it should really make us stop and think about, all right, when we're using these qualitative scales, really what are we doing here? What are we talking about? Okay. So what is most commonly used cyber risk measurement model? It's frankly the mental model of somebody waving a wet finger in there and saying, well, this feels like high risk to me. All right. Some people have answered this question when I ask in conferences. They'll say, well, NIST CSF. NIST CSF is not a risk measurement model. It is arguably, and we could argue about it, a maturity model. It's not measuring risk, right? It's measuring the state of control conditions or maturity in an organization, but in no way is it measuring risk. So, but the mental, when you're thinking about mental models or talking about those, you have to wonder what assumptions are being made, what data are being applied, what formula they're using in their mind, those sorts of things. Again, a lot of room for error, a lot of room for inconsistency and such. And let me give you an example here. So, the short video clip of these cars going around a racetrack, when I show this in at conferences, and then I ask the audience, how fast are they going qualitatively? The answer I get every time is, quote unquote, fast. Well, the question is your fast the same as mine? I'm thinking IndyCar fast. Are you thinking minivan fast? Is your formula for this speed the same as mine? Which car am I referring to? Because one is going way slower than the others, or am I looking for an average? All these things. And my point here is that when you measure something qualitatively, it is incredibly easy to sweep all of these details under the rug and not even consider them. Whereas if I ask someone to measure this quantitatively, to make estimates of the speed of those cars quantitatively, they would have had to ask and answer all these questions before they could give me an answer. So qualitative, most of the qualitative measurements that I see out there, people giving, they haven't even in their own minds clarified what they just measured, which means you really shouldn't place much faith in it, right? And if we're measuring speed, we have to know what the scope is and what model we're using and what data we're applying. Same thing for risk measurement. We have to have the scope of what's being measured before we should have much faith at all in the measurement. And we should have a clearly defined model like FAIR to know what data we need and how to apply the data. And then, of course, we have whatever data we have. So, again, an example where qualitative allows us to be incredibly sloppy and inconsistent, where quantitative doesn't let us get away with that. So I already talked about this. So FAIR, we're not going to go in depth here. There are all kinds of resources out there for that. But it is essentially just this model, this ontology that defines the factors that drive how much risk exists. And these are the things that we can begin to make measurements about, right? Once we've defined the scope of what we're analyzing, the scenario, the loss event scenario, then we kind of overlay this model and say, all right, what's the threat event frequency or vulnerability to it and the various loss factors and such. We can, once we've clearly scoped the scenario, FAIR is this very intuitive, easy to understand model for thinking about loss event frequency and thinking about loss of magnitude. It is not rocket science, which is one of its strengths. It's very pragmatic. And it's not, and we can use this to identify and quantify our top risks and do cost-benefit analysis and all these other things that we want and need to do if we're going to be cost-effective in our programs. The advantages, I already talked about some of these. It's, it helps normalize terminology and mental models. It allows us to do much better risk measurement. Now, here's an important point. It complements common good practice frameworks like NIST-CSF or ISO or PCI DSS or high trust, right? These are excellent frameworks for identifying control deficiencies, but they don't provide the so what, right? Typically what happens is organizations go through the assessments using one of those frameworks and they identify deficiencies, and then someone waves a wet finger in there and says, well, this one feels scariest to me, right? And so where FAIR complements these frameworks is it allows you to understand and be able to defend any measurements of so what. Right? So,
yeah, I think that's a great point. I've found that a lot of, I've adopted FAIR, but it took me a long time, like I know a lot of other security professionals, to find something that was adoptable, just because, to your point, I've seen this in a lot of organizations. You go in, you present your risks, and they can't really argue with the impacts or the lack of those things, but then they want to argue about the postulates. And I've seen it happen time and time again where somebody's just trying to defend what the postulates are. One thing I like about FAIR is that I can basically talk to them in dollars and cents kind of impacts that, and so do you get a lot of pushback on the postulates and on the basis of the determining the outcome?
Well, the first time you put a FAIR analysis or any quantitative analysis in front of executives, almost invariably they will dig in. They want to understand where the numbers came from. They want to make sure you've done your homework. And one of the great things about FAIR is in applying FAIR, you are doing your homework. And I have never once in nearly 20 years of using FAIR as a CISO for 3 different companies and whatnot, I've never not been able to defend my homework, right? And in fact, one of the early mind-blowing experiences for me with FAIR is when I was first developing and beginning to use it. I thought I had to go have this very uncomfortable conversation with a senior executive in the business who had this pet project they wanted to do that was going to drive all kinds of risk into the organization. We'd analyzed it using FAIR. We knew there were options for going forward with his project more sanely and securely, but it was going to cost money. And this guy was not a fan of us to begin with. So I thought, well, I'll try using this FAIR thing. And so I went in and had the conversation with him, and he pushed back on our statement that his thing was going to drive a bunch of risk. And I said, well, let me explain how we came to that. And I went up to the whiteboard, and in 5 or 10 minutes, I broke down our analysis. And at the end of that, he said, well, I guess I can't argue with that. Let's look at those mitigation options. But the coolest thing that came out of that was not that the organization wasn't subjected to more risk, unnecessary risk. The coolest thing that came out of that was he became an advocate for us and a fan of us because he knew we were doing our homework and could defend what the heck we were talking about. That was, to me, that was, just like, I couldn't even describe sort of how that felt to sort of be put on, viewed through that lens finally. So
No, that's
there's
awesome.
huge advantage of that.
That's awesome. So, but that begs the question: what do organizations need then? And I know this seems to be a lot of hesitancy. I know I experienced it myself when I was first looking at qualitative measures and those kind of things. What kind of basic understanding or nomenclature does everybody have to understand? I always felt like everybody had to understand exactly what we were going after on the business side to use this and be successful with it. And I felt like I had to do a lot of training of my executives on how we were looking at risks and whatnot. Can you kind of talk through that a little bit on what kind of building blocks need to be in place, or does it need to be in place?
Yeah, you need all of the people in your organization as a CISO. They need to be understand nomenclature in the same way and understand risk in the same way and be using these terms and thinking consistently. That alone, you'll find tremendous advantages from, just in terms of the quality of conversation and sort of the quality of thinking that goes on. But one of the things I found invaluable was I put my audit colleagues through an abbreviated FAIR training. I put the regulators that I was subject to in financial services, I brought them in for a half day of sort of crash course so that they understood the lens I was seeing the world through. I put, key executive stakeholders through a 1-hour orientation so that they understood. And this, there's that investment up front pays huge dividends later in terms of better communication, less argument, fewer religious arguments, and those sorts of things. So all the conversations become more fact-based and less sort of opinion-based and emotional and that sort of thing. So yes, there is this training that has to go on, this orientation to viewing the world through this lens, but I found it to be incredibly valuable. And organizations that you might think of as being maybe reticent to see the world through this lens, some people believe the regulators, they won't get this. No, that's not been my experience at all. These are smart people who care very much about doing the right thing and understand the notion of cost efficacy and that sort of thing. And I never once had a regulator who wasn't on board with this. Now, some of the conversations with some stakeholders took more time than others, but honestly, the hardest audience I've found for this has been the information security audience. I mean, they drank the Kool-Aid.
I've always been skeptical. I think we're skeptical as a thing, but
it
looks like FAIR at least is getting is become a standard. I know NIST recognized it in FairCon, so that's one reason we're seeing a lot of adoption. We're down to the last 10 minutes. So I'm going to let you finish up the presentation, and then we'll try to have a few questions.
All right, this will go really quickly. I mean, adopting FAIR it imposes change on the organization, and so you need to treat it as you would with any other change effort. You need to have a clear reason for doing it. Otherwise, why go through the change? And maybe that's being able to do cost-benefit analyses. Maybe it's to prioritize more effectively. Maybe it's being driven by regulatory requirements, whatever. But just have a reason for doing it. Don't just do it because it sounds cool, right? Have a very real pain point you're trying to solve. You need critical thinking skills. This is analysis. This isn't checking a box somewhere. This is analysis of a complex landscape. So you need critical thinking skills. That's who needs to be doing the work. Not everybody, and critical thinking is not perfectly correlated with intelligence, right? So I know some people who aren't good critical thinkers who are incredibly intelligent and can run circles around me in other ways, but they aren't analytic. This is an analytic exercise. People doing it need to be analytically inclined. And for organizations that maybe want to kick the tires and try it out, maybe you engage an organization like you guys, TUV OpenSky, to help them sort of do a pilot exercise, see how it works, understand what's involved with it, and that sort of thing. And there's a continuum of growth through this. It isn't like all or nothing. You can dip your toes in these waters, right? So, but you need, at the very least, you need a reason and you need critical thinking skills. If you have those two things, you can do this. you don't need to be a large organization or quote unquote mature. There is no organization I've ever encountered of any size that can't benefit from this, right? From clearer thinking about risk and that sort of thing, everybody benefits from that. So resources out there, I won't spend time talking about this. It's in the, what you can download. The bottom line is we have to apply our resources cost effectively if we want to have any hope of winning or surviving this onslaught with the bad guys. In order to do that, we have to prioritize accurately and choose cost-effective solutions. And you're only going to be able to do that quantitatively. There is no other option, at least until our artificial intelligence overlords take over the world from us and we all get to retire to some beach somewhere. So, questions?
That was fantastic. Thank you. We have a few questions. Going on that last slide, how would an organization get into FAIR or start to adopt FAIR, or start using it quickly on a larger scale without a huge upfront investment in resources and licenses? Do you have to go a big bang where everybody accepts it at once, or can you start it in piecemeal?
No.
How would you do that?
No, in fact, for a lot of organizations, sort of a beachhead approach is better, where you take one thing, like I know one very large organization, very large, complex, very political, very entrenched in old practices and that sort of thing, and they said, you know what, the one problem we can solve with FAIR that can't be solved by anyone else doing any of the old stuff in the organization, all the qualitative measures and that sort of thing, is cost-benefit analysis around major security investments, right? This isn't an everyday decision. It's sort of a once-in-a-while decision, annually, quarterly, those sorts of things. So, and the people who are sort of entrenched in anti-quantitative methods, they're going to agree that they can't solve this problem and that it seems like a really important thing to solve. So, there will be less sort of infighting associated with it. So they started there. They said, we're going to apply FAIR to understanding the cost benefit of our major investments. They did that. They got that beachhead where they had huge success. I mean, executive management was thrilled at being able to understand the cost benefit of, where all these dollars were going. And so once they were successful there, they were able to sort of gradually expand where and how they were applying FAIR. And it is a journey. I know very few organizations who sort of go into this big bang, and it pretty much takes a dictate from the board. If you have a dictate from the board to do it as a big bang, then you can pull it off, right? You'll have the resources and political coverage to do it, but otherwise, plan on choosing a beachhead and evolving from there, showing value, and being smart about dealing with some of the political challenges and whatnot.
So I have two more questions I'd like to get to. One is from S. Darrow. How do you enumerate risk event scenarios in a practical fashion? This seems to be much more arduous than enumerating categories of risk factors, for example, IoT. So I think he's talking, he or she is talking about when we were having the discussion about different types of risks.
Yeah, so the measurement, once you have clarity around what it is you're measuring, the loss event scenario, and you have a model like FAIR that says, all right, we have this scenario, we need to understand the threat event frequency. How often bad actors are attacking us in this manner, let's say. Then you can say, okay, well, we have data around this, maybe some industry data, maybe some logs or experience, whatever. We have information about the controls that are relevant to that scenario. We have information regarding how effective they are and those sorts of things. What seems hard and arduous from a measurement perspective becomes a lot less difficult once you have clarity around the scope of what you're measuring and you have a model like FAIR. Honestly, the learning curve for this is not what many people think it is. A lot of people think, oh, it's complicated and it's, the data must be the hard part. The data is never the hard part. The hard part is scoping. People just aren't used to getting that clarity and thinking in those terms. that's been the learning curve, people going through training. So, you know, I know it, until you've been through it and been trained in that sort of thing, it's easy to look at this and go, well, it seems like that's going to be really hard. And it's not nearly as hard as people imagine once you have the foundation. So
fantastic. Well, we've got about 4 minutes left. I have one other question. How are organizations doing? This is from Louis Yandali. How are organizations doing risk aggregation with FAIR? Is there an example you can share or a process?
Yeah, it's so aggregation. Boy, we could have a whole nother hour-long presentation on it, but it's really about, and it's neither as difficult as people think it is, nor as easy. I mean, there are just some sort of tricks to the trade of doing it well. You simply can't. Here's what I'll say on this. Let's say we analyze 2 loss event scenarios, and their average loss exposure is, for one is 50,000 and the other is 100,000. We can't just say their aggregate is 150,000, because that doesn't take into account the probability component of this. So there's this notion that if you have background in statistics, you may be familiar with Bernoulli and doing Bernoulli analyses. So there are ways of approaching this that are not horribly complex, but they are sort of statistical in nature, and so that's where having tools that take care of that sort of complexity is really important. If you're going to try and do this in a spreadsheet, it's pretty easy to get it wrong. That's the advantage to having a tool where people have already figured that stuff out. So they may not be an entirely satisfactory answer, but that's about the best I can do in 3-4 minutes.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Jack, this has been very informational. I know I've learned a lot on it just by working with you on this, and I'm really excited about FAIR and what and see where it goes, or where it continues to go. So, thank you so much for that. This has been exceptional. Thanks.
Thank you very much.